Today we are going to study one of the most important books in the history of literature, Poetics by Aristotle. At first, the word poetics may sound difficult or highly philosophical. But by the end of this presentation, you will see that Aristotle is simply trying to answer one important question: what makes a good piece of literature? Every time we read a poem, watch a movie, enjoy a play, or even listen to a powerful story, we naturally feel that some stories are unforgettable while others are easily forgotten. Why does this happen? Why does one story make us cry, another inspire us, another frighten us, and another teach us an important lesson? More than 2,300 years ago, Aristotle carefully observed hundreds of Greek plays and poems and searched for the answer to these questions. Instead of giving random opinions, he studied literature scientifically. He looked for patterns. He asked why successful works succeeded and why weak works failed. That careful study became Poetics, the world's first systematic book of literary criticism. It is called the foundation of literary criticism because almost every later literary critic, whether from Europe, America, or Asia, has been influenced by Aristotle's ideas in one way or another. Even today, when filmmakers write movie scripts, novelists build plots, dramatists create characters, or critics analyze literature, many of Aristotle's principles are still being used. In this presentation, we will not simply memorize definitions. We will understand Aristotle's ideas step by step in very simple language. We will use examples from famous stories, plays, and everyday life so that every concept becomes easy to remember. By the end of this presentation, you will understand not only what Aristotle said, but also why his ideas have remained important for more than 2,000 years and why students preparing for competitive examinations continue to study poetics today. So let us begin our journey into Aristotle's fascinating world of literature. Now that we have introduced Aristotle and his masterpiece Poetics, let us look at the roadmap of our entire presentation. Every good journey begins with a map. If we know where we are going, learning becomes much easier. This slide is that map. It tells us what we will study, in what order, and how each topic is connected. As you can see, the course is divided into 4 major sections. Each section builds upon the previous one, so by the end, we will have a complete understanding of Aristotle's literary theory. Let us begin with the first section. The first card is context. Whenever we study a great book, we should first understand the time in which it was written. For example, if someone asks you to understand India's freedom movement without knowing anything about British rule, many events would seem confusing. In the same way, we cannot fully understand poetics without understanding ancient Greece. So, we will first study the Greeks after the 5th century BC, the period when philosophy, drama, politics, and education were developing rapidly. This was the world that shaped Aristotle's thinking. Next, we will briefly study Euripides, one of the greatest Greek tragedians. Aristotle did not invent his ideas by imagination alone. He carefully observed successful plays written by dramatists like Euripides and discovered common principles that made him effective. Finally, we will learn about Aristotle's life. Understanding his background helps us understand why he approached literature scientifically. Instead of asking, "What should literature be?" Aristotle asked, "What makes great literature successful?" This practical approach makes his criticism unique. Now let us move to the second section. This card is called pre-Aristotelian forms. Before Aristotle wrote Poetics, different forms of literature already existed. So, this section helps us understand the literary traditions that influenced him. First, we will study lyric poetry, which expresses personal emotions such as love, sadness, joy, or hope. Even today, many songs are similar to lyric poetry because they focus on feelings rather than long stories. Then we will study comedy, which presents ordinary people in humorous situations. Although comedy makes us laugh, it also teaches lessons by exposing human weaknesses and foolish behavior. Finally, we will study the origins of tragedy. Greek tragedy did not appear suddenly. It slowly developed from religious festivals dedicated to the Greek god Dionysus. Simple songs gradually became dramatic performances, and eventually tragedy became one of the highest forms of literature. This historical background helps us understand why Aristotle gave so much importance to tragedy. Now let us come to the most important section of the entire course. This is core theory, the Poetics. Everything we study before this point prepares us for this section. Here we begin with Mimesis, Aristotle's famous theory of imitation. We will learn that imitation does not mean copying reality like a camera. Instead, literature creatively represents life so that we understand human nature more deeply. Next, we will study the 6 elements of tragedy: plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. Aristotle believed that these 6 elements together create a successful tragedy, and among them, plot is the most important because it gives structure to the entire work. After that, we will study the 3 unities, then understand how a plot is constructed through ideas like reversal, recognition, and scenes of suffering. Finally, we will study the tragic hero, one of Aristotle's greatest contributions to literature. We will discover why the hero is usually neither perfectly good nor completely evil, but an ordinary human being who makes a serious mistake that changes everything. Now let us look at the final section. This is legacy and synthesis. Learning a theory is useful, but understanding its influence is even more important. Here we will study how Aristotle defended poetry against Plato's criticism. We will also see how Poetics became the foundation of literary criticism and influenced writers, dramatists, and critics for more than 2,000 years. Finally, we will compare Aristotle's ideas with other literary theories so that we understand both his strengths and his limitations. Before we move to the next slide, notice the quotation at the bottom. Poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history. This statement may sound surprising. History tells us what actually happened in the past, but poetry teaches universal truths about human life, truths that apply to everyone, regardless of time or place. That is why Aristotle believed poetry has a deeper philosophical value than history. This single quotation beautifully captures the spirit of Poetics, and by the end of this presentation, you will fully understand why Aristotle made this remarkable claim. So, this slide gives us the complete roadmap of our learning journey. First, we understand the historical background. Then we explore the literary traditions before Aristotle. Next, we study his core theory in depth. Finally, we examine his lasting influence on literature and criticism. With this roadmap in mind, we are now ready to begin our first major topic, the historical context of Aristotle's Poetics. Now we begin our first major topic, the historical background of Poetics. Many students make the mistake of jumping directly into Aristotle's theory. But imagine trying to understand a person's decisions without knowing anything about their life or the world they lived in. It would be very difficult. The same is true for Aristotle. Before we study what he wrote, we must first understand the world in which he lived. This slide shows us how Greece changed from the 5th century BC to the 4th century BC. These changes shaped Aristotle's thinking and eventually led him to write Poetics. Let us first look at the top part of the timeline. It is called the 5th century Golden Age. The 5th century BC is often called the Golden Age of Greece because almost every field reached an extraordinary level of excellence. Philosophy, politics, architecture, sculpture, literature, and drama all flourished during this period. Think of it as the golden period of Greek civilization, just as people sometimes call the Gupta period the golden age of ancient India because of its achievements in literature, science, and art. The first point on the timeline is the era of Aeschylus and Sophocles. These were 2 of the greatest Greek tragedians. Aeschylus is often called the father of tragedy because he transforms simple dramatic performances into complex plays with multiple actors. Sophocles developed tragedy even further by creating more realistic characters and stronger plots. His famous play Oedipus Rex later became Aristotle's favorite example of a perfect tragedy. So, before Aristotle became a critic, Greece had already produced outstanding dramatists. The next event is the Peloponnesian War. This was a long and destructive war between Athens and Sparta. Imagine two powerful countries fighting for many years. Such wars damage not only armies but also society, education, trade, and people's confidence. Before the war, Athens was proud, wealthy, and culturally rich. After the war, Greece became politically weaker and people began questioning old beliefs. This change encouraged philosophers to think more deeply about society, morality, and human behavior. The next point is the organic peak of the polis. Now, what does the word polis mean? A polis simply means a Greek city-state, such as Athens or Sparta. Each polis had its own government, army, and culture. During the Golden Age, these city-states became highly developed centers of learning, democracy, and artistic achievement. But eventually this system also began to weaken. Now let us move to the lower part of the timeline, called the 4th century shift. This is the period when Aristotle actually lived and worked. The first major event is the rise of Macedon. After years of conflict among the Greek city-states, Macedonia became the dominant power under King Philip II. Later, Philip's son, Alexander the Great, spread Greek culture across Asia and parts of Africa. As a result, Greek ideas were no longer limited to small city-states. They became international. This wider cultural world is known as the Hellenistic Age. The next change is professionalization of theatre. Earlier, dramatic performances were mainly connected with religious festivals. Gradually, theatre became more organized and professional. Playwrights, actors, and producers became skilled specialists. Competition among dramatists increased, and audiences expected better quality plays. This gave Aristotle many excellent examples to study. Instead of imagining what a tragedy should be, he could observe hundreds of successful plays and identify the principles behind them. The next point is the shift toward rhetoric. Rhetoric means the art of effective speaking and persuasion. People became increasingly interested in logic, debate, argument, and communication. Education also focused more on reasoning than on simply repeating traditions. This atmosphere greatly influenced Aristotle. His writing is logical, systematic, and analytical because he belonged to a culture that valued clear reasoning. Finally, we reach Aristotle's retrospective analysis. This is perhaps the most important idea on this slide. Notice that Aristotle was not writing while tragedy was still developing. Instead, he looked back at centuries of great literature. Imagine a cricket coach watching hundreds of international matches before writing a book called How Great Cricket is Played. The coach is not inventing the rules. He is observing successful players and identifying the common techniques that make them successful. Aristotle did exactly the same thing with literature. He carefully studied masterpieces written by dramatists like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Then he asked, what makes these plays great? His answers became the principles we now study in Poetics. Now let us read the speech bubble on the right. It says, while the 5th century created the art, the post-5th century created the theory of the art. This sentence beautifully summarizes the entire slide. The 5th century produced great writers and great plays. The 4th century produced thinkers who analyzed those plays and explained why they worked so well. In simple words, the artists came first, and the critics came later. Aristotle belonged to the second group. He was not primarily creating tragedies. He was studying them scientifically. That is why many scholars call this period the Age of the Critic. Before we move to the next slide, let us connect everything we have learned. The Golden Age gave Greece great dramatists. Wars changed society and encouraged deeper thinking. Macedonia united the Greek world and spread its culture. Theatre became more professional. People valued logic and careful observation. And finally, Aristotle examined the greatest plays ever written and developed the world's first systematic theory of literature. This historical background is essential because Poetics did not appear suddenly. It was the result of centuries of dramatic achievement and intellectual development. Now that we understand the world in which Aristotle lived, we are ready to study one of the greatest tragedians who influenced his thinking, Euripides. Now that we understand the historical background of Greece, let us study one of the greatest dramatists who influenced Aristotle's thinking, Euripides. Many students ask an important question: why are we studying Euripides in a presentation about Aristotle? The answer is simple. Aristotle did not create his theory by sitting in a room and imagining what a good tragedy should look like. He carefully read and analyzed the plays written by great dramatists like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. By comparing their works, he discovered the principles of successful tragedy. So, understanding Euripides helps us understand why Aristotle praised certain dramatic techniques in Poetics. Now, look at this slide. It compares two different styles of Greek drama. On the left side, we have idealized myth, represented by Aeschylus and Sophocles. On the right side, we have psychological realism, represented by Euripides. This comparison shows how Greek tragedy gradually changed over time. Let us first understand the left side. Idealized myth. Aeschylus and Sophocles. Aeschylus and Sophocles usually wrote plays based on famous Greek myths. Their stories focused mainly on gods, destiny, and fate. People believed that human life was controlled by divine powers. For example, in Sophocles' famous play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus tries everything possible to escape a prophecy. However, despite all his efforts, the prophecy comes true. This teaches the audience that human beings cannot escape fate. So, the first point says, focus on divine will. In these plays, the gods are powerful, and human beings often appear helpless before destiny. The second point says, cosmic order and fate. The word cosmic simply means the universe. These playwrights believed that the universe follows a moral order created by the gods. Whenever someone breaks this order through pride, arrogance, or wrongdoing, punishment eventually follows. Think of it like breaking the law of gravity. Whether you believe in gravity or not, if you jump from a tall building, gravity will affect you. Similarly, in Greek tragedy, anyone who breaks the moral order eventually faces consequences. The third point is elevated, archaic language. The word archaic means old-fashioned. The characters in these plays spoke in highly poetic, formal, and grand language. Their speeches sounded majestic and noble rather than ordinary. Imagine the difference between everyday conversation and the language used in an ancient king's speech. That is the kind of language Aeschylus and Sophocles preferred. Now let us move to the right side. Psychological realism. Euripides. Euripides introduced something new into Greek tragedy. Instead of concentrating mainly on gods and destiny, he focused on human psychology. He wanted audiences to understand why people think, feel, and behave in certain ways. The first point says, grounded, flawed psychology. Unlike earlier heroes who often appeared larger than life, Euripides created characters with real emotions and real weaknesses. His heroes could become jealous. They could become angry. They could become confused. They could make mistakes. In other words, they behaved like ordinary human beings. Think about modern films. The characters we admire most are often not perfect superheroes. Instead, they are ordinary people struggling with difficult choices. Euripides introduced this realistic style more than 2,000 years ago. The second point says, focus on human motivation. Instead of asking, "What do the gods want?" Euripides asked, "Why did this person make this decision?" He tried to explain actions through human emotions like love, fear, revenge, ambition, and jealousy. This made his plays feel much more realistic. Even today, psychologists and novelists study people's motivations in exactly the same way. The third point says, colloquial phrasing. The word colloquial means everyday language. Instead of making every character speak in highly formal poetry, Euripides often used language that sounded closer to normal conversation. As a result, audiences found his characters more believable. They felt they were watching real people rather than distant mythical heroes. This was a revolutionary change in Greek drama. Now let us look at the small box at the bottom called diagnostic, diction shift. The word diction simply means choice of words. This box explains that Euripides carefully selected words that sounded both natural and artistic. He wanted his dialogue to feel realistic while still remaining beautiful enough for poetry. This is very important because Aristotle later discusses diction as one of the 6 elements of tragedy. According to Aristotle, a playwright should choose words carefully. Language should neither be too ordinary nor unnecessarily difficult. Good diction creates beauty without confusing the audience. Before we move to the next slide, let us compare these 2 dramatists using a simple example. Imagine 2 teachers explaining the same topic. The first teacher says, "Everything happens because destiny has already decided it." The second teacher says, "People's decisions and emotions shape their future." Both teachers are explaining life, but they are approaching it differently. Similarly, Aeschylus and Sophocles emphasized fate and divine order, while Euripides emphasized human psychology and motivation. Aristotle studied both styles carefully. He appreciated the greatness of earlier tragedy, but he also admired how Euripides made characters more human and emotionally believable. This gradual development in drama helped Aristotle understand what makes a tragedy truly powerful. As we continue through Poetics, we will see that Aristotle's ideas about character, plot, and human emotion were greatly influenced by observing dramatists like Euripides. Now that we have understood one of the greatest playwrights before Aristotle, we are ready to learn about the man himself, Aristotle, his life, education, and the experiences that shaped the writing of Poetics. Now let's move to Aristotle's life and his contribution to literature and art. Aristotle is called the biologist of art because he studied literature in the same careful and scientific way that a biologist studies living things. He believed that every work of art has different parts, and each part has an important purpose. Let us understand this slide step by step. First, let us look at Aristotle as a person. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in a place called Stagira, in ancient Greece. His father was a doctor, so from childhood, Aristotle learned to observe nature carefully. This habit of observing things later became the foundation of his thinking. He became a student of the famous philosopher Plato. After studying for many years, Aristotle became the teacher of Alexander the Great, one of the greatest kings in history. Later, Aristotle started his own school called the Lyceum, where he taught philosophy, science, politics, ethics, and literature. Now let us understand Aristotle's method. Unlike Plato, Aristotle believed that knowledge should come from observation and experience, not only from imagination or ideal ideas. He carefully watched how people behaved, how nature worked, and how literature affected human emotions. For example, if we want to know how a tree grows, we do not simply imagine it. We observe the tree, its roots, trunk, branches, leaves, and fruits. In the same way, Aristotle believed that a poem or a play should also be studied by looking at all its parts. He compared a literary work to a living organism. Just as a human body has a heart, brain, lungs, and other organs that work together, A good story also has important parts such as the plot, characters, setting, language, and theme. If one important part is weak or missing, the whole story becomes less effective. For example, imagine watching a movie with excellent actors but no proper story. Even though the acting is good, the movie will not be enjoyable because the plot is weak. This is exactly what Aristotle meant when he said that every part of a literary work must work together. Now let us understand Aristotle's contribution. Before Aristotle, Plato judged poetry mainly from a moral point of view. He believed poetry could mislead people and therefore should be controlled. Aristotle had a different opinion. He believed that literature should be judged by how well it is written, how effectively its parts are organized, and how successfully it creates emotions in the audience. Because of this, Aristotle became the first great literary critic. His ideas helped people understand how good literature is created and how it should be analyzed. Even today, students and teachers around the world study his ideas when learning about stories, dramas, novels, and films. To conclude, Aristotle changed the way people looked at literature. He taught us that a work of art should be studied carefully, just like a scientist studies nature. His ideas continue to guide literary criticism even after more than 2,000 years.